Today, many focus on spirituality, perhaps Christian meditation, while others might put all of their attention on special devotions and formal prayers. We could even use words like liberal Catholics or traditionalist Catholics. The problem of trying to keep us all together has been a real challenge for the Church since the Second Vatican Council. And if you remember, it was only about 10 years ago that the saintly Cardinal Bernardin of Chicago established the Common Ground Project, so that Catholics of all persuasions would respect each other and not judge each other, but would see that what draws them together is far more than what tends to separate them. Okay, so coming back now to Paul, it's difficult to say, really, who the strong and who the weak really are. But it's most likely that the weak are those Jewish Christians for whom some of their cultural heritage remains very, very important. They would perhaps strongly prefer kosher-type meals, in case the meat had been wrongfully prepared or prayed over by pagans. And they found that some of the rituals they practiced on certain days very sustaining to them in their prayer life. We know that Jews tended to fast on Mondays and Thursdays, so they might have kept that going. Paul himself classed himself with the strong, and he wants to change the attitudes of the strong and the weak. As for the person who is weak in faith, accept that person, but not with a view to settling matters on which there is a dispute. That's very wise advice from St. Paul. Don't argue. It'll get you nowhere. It's all a matter of accepting each other. And then he says, let no one who eats belittle the one who abstains, and let not the one who abstains pass judgment on the one who eats. That's precisely what's happening within the community. The enlightened are belittling, poking fun at the more observant ones, and the more observant ones are judging the enlightened ones. Paul then says that both groups have got to accept each other as sincere. Both are grateful to God. Both have their inner dispositions of wanting to live in the Lord. And that's what's important. That's all that's important. And then he uses the image of a slave who uselessly criticizes a fellow slave when everybody's well-being is tied up with what the master says. And that's all that matters. And so it is for us. Leave any judgment to the Lord himself. Paul continues, none of us lives for ourself alone. None of us dies to oneself alone. If we live to the Lord. And if we die to the Lord. So whether we live or whether we die, we belong to the Lord. It's a beautiful passage, and it's often used in funerals because it seems so apposite. It does possibly come from an early Christian hymn, and Paul uses it to say that we belong through our baptism to the Lord. Our Christian life, including our dying, is centered on the Lordship of Jesus. That's our ultimate focus, living for the Lord. So who are you to pass judgment on a fellow believer? Well, judgment's clearly not our prerogative. It belongs only to the Lord. Each of us will have to give an account of oneself before God. And that's how Paul concludes this section. Now we come to the fifth and the final section. The strong need to exercise tolerance We're in chapter 14, as you know, and it's from verse 13 to 33, the end of the chapter. Paul focuses now on the strong, and he implores them not to become a stumbling block for the weak. And this, of course, is exactly the teaching of Jesus. In Mark 9, verse 42, anyone who is an obstacle to bring down one of these little ones who have faith would be better thrown into the sea with a great millstone tied around their neck. Very strong language. That's what Jesus said. The strong, in a real sense, have a deep responsibility towards the weak, the little ones, and should guard against doing or saying anything that would offend them or scandalize them. Paul continues by acknowledging that nothing is really unclean in itself, and again he's following the example and the teaching of Jesus. Mark chapter 7 verse 15, nothing that goes into a person from the outside can make that person unclean. It's things that come out of a person that make that person unclean. And then Jesus lists the various sins. However, if you really believe it is unclean, well then it is unclean for you. And this is the thing that the weak people have. They really think it's unclean. They can't get it out of their mind. It's so important to them to follow that. Therefore, to follow their conscience, they have to abstain. Paul says, if your fellow believer is being injured on account of what you eat, you're no longer proceeding according to love. Isn't it beautiful? It's love. Love for our fellow believer. Love for a member of our faith that guides all our actions. And Paul adds rather strongly, don't let what you eat destroy the one for whom Christ died. Isn't it powerful? And it would destroy them if he or she was pressured into doing something against their conscience. And Paul is saying, Jesus died for them. Never forget that. So much did he love them. So much did he love them, he died for them. So you've got to love them and refrain from doing anything that would hurt their conscience. Paul then says how the freedom to eat or drink, whatever we like, pales into insignificance when we think of what God's kingdom is truly like. It's a kingdom of righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Spirit. Let us pursue what makes for peace, says Paul, and for building one another up personally. It's rather beautiful, isn't it? And now, a final word. Paul says, it is an admirable thing not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything else likely to make your fellow believer stumble. It's a wonderful thing to watch what you say or do so that you never ever cause offense to a fellow believer. Because the weak have got to follow their conscience. And if they follow you, who are strong, they become guilty of doing something wrong. But you know, in itself, it's not wrong. Paul can see the situation so clearly, and he asks the strong to act always out of love for the fellow believer whom he calls, in this case, weak, so that they are free to do what their conscience dictates and are not trapped into doing something they'll later squirm about. I think as we listen to all that, we would agree that Paul is a rather sensitive and rather brilliant pastoral theologian. Thank you.